the demands of story writing. Telling. Goodness, I can't get the words right. Both reading and writing for both of us this week, we have noticed some things in a distinction between what we're calling storytelling and storycraft. It's the best word we can come up with so far. We'll talk more about that later. In the meantime, what have you been reading this week?
So, book that I'm currently reading is Phantom Tollbooth. It's one you just read for the first time recently. It's one I have read probably like a dozen or so times already.
I thought this was like your second time.
No.
Wow.
I've read it a lot. But this is my first time reading it since we have started our writing process. So I'm coming at this reading a little bit differently than all of the other readings. And I'm noticing a little bit more of the storytelling nature of what he is doing. And there are a couple areas that I have seen specifically that he just does a really good job of depicting the scene and describing it in a way that is very creative. And one of those, the sentence goes, "The late afternoon sunlight leaped lightly from leaf to leaf, slid along branches and down trunks, and dropped finally to the ground in warm, luminous patches." And it's a very creative way of describing the way that the sun lights the surrounding area. And then it goes on to say, "A soft glow filled the air with the kind of light that made everything look sharp and clear and close enough to reach out and touch." It's a very interesting way of describing things that really makes you feel like you're there and gives a very vivid description. And then also the fact that the sunlight leaped lightly from leaf to leaf, the way that kind of flows nicely. There's a lot of instances of that where he is describing things in a way that I would not have been able to come up with myself, but it does a really good job of helping you visualize what is going on in the scene.
And that alliteration there, the painting of that picture feels very much like some of the other authors that I've been reading, which is different from when I read that and just talked about it a couple of weeks ago, whenever it was, that I felt it was more Roald Dahl, Willy Wonka-esque, and I didn't notice things like that. So I'm glad that you reread it for the 11th time.
Yep. And then a book that I finished reading a week or so ago, that one, the storytelling was not quite as good. At least that's what I noticed in the beginning. A lot of the descriptions seemed a little amateurish, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why. It definitely didn't have the vivid nature that the passage did in that book that I just read. But I noticed that when I got about a third of the way through that previous book, I stopped noticing the amateurishness of the writing. And I don't think the reason was that the writing actually got that much better after that third way point, but I think the plot developed a little bit more and it became more intriguing. And so my focus became more on the plot than it did on the way things were described. And so I didn't notice as much of the shortcomings of the storytelling because the storycraft was so good. And that's getting into that distinction that we're making there between those two.
So the storytelling is really about details like the alliteration, the painting of the picture, helping people fully immerse themselves in all of the senses of the environment and the setting. Whereas the storycraft is, how does one event lead to another? What are the surprises? How are the characters developed? How well do you get to know them? We call that storycraft just because we haven't come up with a better word for it. But coming up with better words, that's part of the storytelling. So we're kind of delaying that. And that's what we've noticed with our current writing efforts as well. But before we get into what we did writing, my reading this week, I looked at Andromeda Strain, read that from Michael Crichton. And that one, I felt a little bit different between Andromeda Strain, which was his first novel that he published under his own name, and Jurassic Park that I mentioned earlier. I could definitely tell that the story crafting was much richer in Jurassic Park. And there are moments where sometimes it was the storytelling that kind of made up for storycraft, and sometimes it was the storycraft that made up for a weakness in storytelling. They would kind of go back and forth with Andromeda Strain. But in spite of that there were shortcomings that needed to be made up. It was still considered a very successful novel. There was a movie made out of it. So that gives a little bit of hope as we're looking forward to trying to hone our craft. But the writing that we've each done, my writing, I was focused on just trying to come up with a scene, and I found myself recognizing some weakness in the story craft, weakness in the story writing. I know that in between all of my dialogue, the so-and-so did this, and they did this, and they did this. It was very dull, dry, flat, but it's okay. It's my first draft. I'm learning to set aside the demands of story writing. Telling. Goodness, I can't get the words right. Set aside the demands of storytelling and just focus on the development of the story itself.
And I'm experiencing kind of the same thing in the scene that I'm writing. I am trying to figure out what characters are going to be doing, what they're going to be thinking. And in what I wrote this week, when I showed it to you to get your feedback, I said, this is not going to be anywhere close to how it is going to be written in the actual book itself. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on in this scene. What is this character thinking? How is this character responding? Once I figure out that stuff, then I can work on figuring out how do I describe those things in the book.
And you presented it almost as a stream of consciousness.
Right.
So as I read it, I could get into his head and understand what he's noticing and feel it, even if that's not the way we would end up presenting it. So I think that was a very effective way to share our work in progress with each other for review. So that's what we've been doing, looking at the difference between story crafting, the story craft and storytelling.
There we go.
You know what it is. So our question for you is, where have you noticed in a story that one of those has had to make up for the other, where the vivid descriptions made up for a lack of plot, or the very rich plot made up for some flat descriptions? Let us know that in the comments, and we will see you again in 2 weeks.